Trigger warning. This episode contains descriptions of bodily harm and injury. Chapter 1. Bigfoot. It was raining that day, so hard that the roof sounded like God was sprinkling diamonds from above. A symphony of sounds that was more torturous than anything. The drops hit in odd intervals, uneven, clicking and clacking, and then thunder broke with a crash like pots and pans. After, it felt like the world was quiet, despite the crackle of unending rain. Soon my mama came out of her office to inform me to stay inside. She said something about a siren, but couldn't finish her sentence before I heard it myself. In the distance, wailing like an orphan, the sound of severe weather sirens, booming like an orchestra. My mama warned me to stay away from the windows. Stay inside. You don't want to be caught in the rain. You'll get sick. Stay inside and away from the windows. I was only 7 or maybe 8 at the time. The rumbles rolling through the floor were like the sound of a movie in a theater, thumping in your heart. It caused nothing but slight anxiety and a desire to see more. It was raining so hard at that point I thought it was hail, and I went to the window to look. It was hail, but through the window I saw my neighbor in his kitchen window, Mr. Sanders. He's a real tall man, 6'5". He and I used to play catch with his old rugby ball when my mom was at work. She didn't know we were playing. In fact, she warned me to stay away from him at all times. I was a kid, of course, and I didn't listen. But Mr. Sanders never struck me as someone who could harm me. Just an old man living alone in the mountains, tired and bored, that's all. All I knew of him was of his glory days, playing for the rugby team from stories he would tell me, and his ritual of grilling steaks. Steaks in the heat of July. That's all. Before this, I never connected the two. He even had a meat freezer, for Pete's sake. He told me he had multiple. I'm sorry, I have to go. I'm feeling a bit sick. That was the end of Sarah Ferguson's first recording session with me. She left so quickly after the meeting that she forgot her purse and came back in the middle of the night 2 days later, asking for it. During that encounter, I managed to sit her down and ask her to finish her story of her encounter with a creature known most popularly as Bigfoot. Sarah was quite a hefty woman, around 6 feet and built like a boxer, though looking at her personality-wise, how she gripped the teacup shaking, I think it's safe to say that she was quite nervous. Immediately I decided to ask her about that old man's meat freezer. Did this man seem to eat a lot of meat? Had she seen him eat it before? To which she told me how on the 4th of July, the whole county would be at Sanders' cookout to watch the fireworks. Apparently he had the best view in town. Though this is when Miss Ferguson started to defend Mr. Sanders. I did not think too much of it in the moment, but as we continued through the interview process, it struck me as odd. To discover more about this Mr. Sanders, I decided to ask Miss Ferguson about her time playing with him when she was little, to which she continued to insist he was a good man. She tried to divert the topic from Sanders to her encounter in the woods, but before she could, I managed to ask her about the time she saw Mr. Sanders in the window, one day in the rain. Again, she started to disenchant her account with details such as, "Oh, it was raining. Oh, I was quite young. Oh, the storm was so bad, the lights were flickering. Lord knows I couldn't see that well." But I persisted and came across an important piece of information. Through the window that night, Miss Ferguson saw Sanders with a slab of animal meat, which he had yet to skin. Before she could continue her account, however, she became so revolted with her own experience, she fled into my bathroom to vomit. She was in there for an awfully long time, and halfway through, peeked her head out to ask for a roll of bandages. I thought nothing of it. Perhaps she had slipped and cut herself somewhere. I just found it odd how much she used. Then she peeked her head out of the bathroom again and asked for her jacket. Once she had settled down, jacket sleeves pulled to her wrist, she told me, shakily near tears, how the skin of the meat was tattooed with iridescent flowers. Not the typical numbers they tattoo on animals, but designs and whorls crafted by a human hand, for human skin. I must say this is the most collected and steady she'd been all night. I had reason to think this account was accurate, were it not for the immediate denial after. Once again, citing the rain, the lights, her age, as an excuse for Mr. Sanders' behavior. To steer her from further conversation about nausea-inducing matters, I inquired about her time in the woods, which she spoke briefly about before her first interview. That same night, Miss Ferguson told me she had gone out for a minute to bring the dog back inside, but instead found herself having blacked out and awakening in the presence of multiple men, all the size and height of Mr. Sanders, built like wrestlers or firefighters, well over 6-7 feet. Among them was Mr. Sanders. When I asked Miss Ferguson if she'd heard their conversation, she said all she heard was Mr. Sanders grunt, "Timothy, hold this," and hand to the men a young boy, around 13. Then the men proceeded to skin him. It was quite gruesome from Miss Ferguson's account. After they were finished flaying the poor boy, they dropped the skin right by her face, rosy with blood. When they chopped the boy to pieces, chunks of it splattered to the ground on Miss Ferguson and her hair. They roasted him like a pig, she told me. The smell of skin burning and rain in the ground was more than I could bear. Luckily, Miss Ferguson was able to escape before anything serious happened to her. The authorities were never called on Sanders and his crew, since Miss Ferguson's mother didn't believe what her daughter had been through. And I must say, it is quite hard to believe. Miss Ferguson herself thought it was a dream, until recently. She had come to me this late because she had been noticing changes within herself. She showed me a photo dated to the month before, and yes, she was, in fact, different. The girl in the photo was no more than 5'5", and perhaps 130 pounds, but the lady in front of me, she was quite built. At the time, I could excuse it. Though it may be strenuous, building the body Miss Ferguson now had could have been possible. But the height? That was a different matter altogether. There is no explanation for a growth of over 2 feet in a month. There was no explanation for Miss Ferguson's growth of body here either. It may be rude to comment on a woman's body like this, but the circumstances call for it. Miss Ferguson was hairier than an average woman, especially as she sat before me now. I could see the small strands sticking out from her nose when she sniffled, and the way she scratched at her arms like she wasn't used to the bushiness of the hair. When I politely inquired about this, Miss Ferguson did admit, as much as she tried to shave and contain her hair, there was nothing she could do. And, of course, to continue on my business of asking young ladies rude questions, I inquired about her age. I must warn you, because of her physical appearance, I had been calling her Mrs. Ferguson until now. I was pleasantly shocked to hear she was but a girl of 20. Next, I asked her quite a private question about her menstrual cycle, mainly when it started, to which she answered, 12, sir, which made the situation make a bit more sense. To wrap up, I finally questioned her about any abnormalities she'd been experiencing since her physical changes started. This was when she revealed to me how she'd been eating nothing but meat for the past month. At this point, the blood on Miss Ferguson's arm was quite noticeable. It dripped and leaked through her arm and stained the sleeve of her jacket. But she hadn't seemed to notice, and because of her current, perhaps disoriented mental state, I decided not to question it and continue with the interview. I decided to ask her about her craving for human meat. She got quite offended at this and asked if I was implying she was a cannibal or a monster, outright yelling these things in the dead of the night in my office. To calm Miss Ferguson, I asked if she thought of herself as kind. She replied yes, and regaled me with stories in her youth where she caught butterflies and let them go, or brought lost puppies in from the rain. At this minute, I noticed something very peculiar. There was a red-crusted stain around Miss Ferguson's mouth. I inquired if it was lipstick, to which she pulled out a stick from her purse, baby pink, that was completely not the blood-red stain around her mouth. So I posed my final question. Had she, Miss Ferguson, in an attempt to ignore the impulses of eating human meat, started eating herself? She stuttered in response, turning all shades of red in anger and embarrassment, calling me all sorts of names before storming out of my office, dripping blood on the carpet on her way out. In her fit of confused rage, she fainted in front of my apartment building. The ambulance was called by the store worker on the first floor, and at around 2 a.m. I was abruptly woken up by the same store worker who told me Sarah had been admitted to the ICU for severe blood loss caused by an animal bite. Though which animal, the doctors are not so sure. Of course, since Miss Ferguson was my client, I had to take responsibility for her and made plans to see her the next morning, but by then she had passed away. The funeral was held outside her home, which I attended out of respect. After all, the young girl had come to me for help, and I could do nothing. It was an open, quite large casket with a white sheet covering her body. Friends and family had a chance to peel the veil down for one last look at young Sarah Ferguson. When it came my turn, however, I picked up the sheet around her arm. The bite was sickly and pulsing red, even in death. The smell hit my nose for just long enough for me to gag. I covered my nose quickly as well as her hand. I must have adjusted the cloth incorrectly. Her blood continued to seep through. Quickly a guide came and ushered me aside. He flipped the cloth up and shouted orders for a towel. Her arm was completely exposed now, and everyone could see what had happened to Sarah Ferguson. Like a chewed-out stalk of corn, bite marks marred her forearms, bloody, continually bleeding. Anyone could see. The wound was not from an animal. Her teeth had dug in deep, tore out her own muscle, her own veins. They bled like they were crying. Young Sarah Ferguson, if I had to break it down, had an encounter with Bigfoot, multiple of them. Not a rare sight at all, since they tend to lean on each other to survive, much like humans. From what I presume, Mr. Sanders was one as well as the group that Sarah encountered. The girl was quite lucky to escape, and lucky to be young as well, but not so lucky as to escape the sight of one of these so-called feasts. Traditionally, Bigfoots held a feast to induct a new member. The member was only to witness these feasts to start their transformation. Sarah Ferguson, being so young at the time, did not start her transition till she was out of her pubescent years. Though there is only one recorded case of this, I infer that Bigfoot transformations are only possible after one is physically an adult. It must have come as quite the surprise to Miss Ferguson. Traditional markers of Bigfoot are abnormal height and weight, and a craving for human meat, which Sarah had started to exhibit. As we can see in Mr. Sanders, and sadly Sarah Ferguson as well, both could not satisfy their cravings for it with regular animal or poultry meat, and ended up succumbing to a cannibalistic diet, one way or another. This concludes Chapter 1.